All right, we're going to look at John Quincy Adams' presidency, and and he really kind of, in a lot of ways, starts off the era or the age of Jackson. It's kind of strange to start off with John Quincy Adams as your first president during the age of Jackson, but a lot of the things that actually define Jackson's presidency and that time start with John Quincy Adams' presidency. So let's get started. So the big thing that is known that happens prior to Jackson being elected is this expanding suffrage, and suffrage is simply the social studies word or the history word for the right to vote or voting. And so expanding suffrage simply means more people are voting. It's growing. And the reason it's growing is because property qualifications are no longer are being dropped from the requirements to be able to vote. So the older states, the original 13 states, had a property qualifications in most cases. You had to own a certain amount of property to vote. Well, the newer states, as you know, you can see that Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, Indiana, Illinois, Missouri. We've added all these states by 1824. Well, as these states were added, they didn't really, most of them didn't have property qualifications. And so people start in the older states start to say, wait a second, if I was in this other state, I wouldn't have to have property to vote. So all these people over there have the right to vote, but I don't. This doesn't seem right. And so the older states begin to drop their property qualifications. At the same time, so what's happening? We've got expanding suffrage for white men. This is a huge change actually, because there's a lot. We're talking about thousands and thousands of people, state by state, that are gaining the right to vote when you drop the property qualification. But while that's happening, in a few states, property qualifications were the only thing that restricted the right to vote. So there were free African Americans in some of these states that actually had the right to vote because they owned property. And as the property qualifications are dropped in those states, in most cases, um, the African Americans then lost the right to vote. So as the property qualifications are reduced, other qualifications like African Americans can't vote are then put in, and so African Americans are actually losing the right to vote in some cases. It doesn't have a large impact on the total number of voters because there was so relatively few African Americans that did have this right at this time. So the election of 1824 is often called the corrupt bargain. It was called that by Andrew Jackson, and this is we think of 2016 election as the dirtiest election ever and maybe the worst election ever. Well, the election of 1824 would certainly give it a run for its money. Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams, there was no love for one another there. There was a deep dislike for each other. Jackson ends up winning the popular vote, and he wins the electoral vote, sort of. He wins the most votes. That's called a plurality. He wins a plurality. So you see, winning the popular vote doesn't win you the election. As we know, Donald Trump did not win the popular vote, but he won the electoral college vote. So the popular vote, he wins 43%. You don't have to win a majority of the popular vote to win. You do have to win a majority of the electoral college vote. You'll see what it says here. He won a plurality. Plurality means the most without reaching the threshold of majority. You have to have over 50%. 50% plus one is a majority. He did not reach that in the Electoral College. And so when the Electoral College does not decide who wins, it goes to the House of Representatives. Well, you'll notice there's actually 4 people that ran for president at this time. And John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson, Crawford, and Clay. So Clay doesn't attain high enough to be chosen or even considered by the House of Representatives, and so he's going to decide who he votes for. But Henry Clay is a very influential member of the House of Representatives. He has a lot of power in the House of Representatives, and therefore a lot of other people, he can persuade them to vote the way he wants them to vote. And Clay ends up supporting John Quincy Adams. and therefore he wins in the House of Representatives and wins the election. Well, Andrew Jackson says this is a travesty. He won the most votes. He should have been selected by the House of Representatives. Well, that's not the way the system works. The House of Representatives gets to choose whoever they vote on. Whoever they choose is who is president. Well, John Quincy Adams then selects Henry Clay as his Secretary of State, which on the surface does kind of look like, wait a second, he voted for you, now you're making him Secretary of State. The other side of that, though, is Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams already have a history of showing that they pretty much agree on many of the key policy issues. They very much are in agreement with each other on a lot of different issues, and so it's not surprising that Clay would support Adams and that Adams would select him as his Secretary of State. Now, the other issue that makes that particularly difficult for Andrew Jackson is the Secretary of State at this point is kind of like the next step to becoming the president. Thomas Jefferson had been a Secretary of State. James Madison had been his Secretary of State. James Monroe had been Madison's Secretary of State. John Quincy Adams had been Monroe's Secretary of State. And so now Adams picks Clay. It's very likely that, it seems very possible that Clay would then be the next chosen president. And so this is all goes against what Andrew Jackson stands for. He stands for this idea of the common man. And so now with this, the House of Representatives picking him, it's not the people have picked Adams. The people in Washington have picked Adams. He's the insider. It very much sounds like some of the talk that happens today with our most recent elections. So John Quincy Adams as president, he supports a high tariff. He supports the American system, Henry Clay's American system, which is a high tariff, internal improvements, and the national bank and things like that. He is able to get a few of these internal improvements passed, but not a lot of them. He is able to cut the national debt as well during this time, but part of that is because some of the projects that he supported weren't actually passed by the Congress. Henry Clay is his closest advisor, and right before John Quincy Adams leaves, he passes what's known as the Tariff of 1828, or the Tariff of Abominations. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about that right now because that's going to be in the next video for you. But John Quincy Adams is not a popular president. He's a difficult person to work with often. He's very secure in his own belief and what he thinks is right, and so therefore he often is unbending. And his father was a president, and this is the time when we have the rise of the common man. More and more people without property are having the right to vote, and so he is not kind of seen as on their side. And banks aren't popular, and Andrew Jackson is against banks. And so the next election is going to come up, and John Quincy Adams is going to lose. And he is not going to be president for 8 years. He's going to be president just for 4 years. And that ends a string of presidents being president for 8 years. John Quincy Adams actually goes on to serve in the House of Representatives and really does a lot of interesting things. But we're not going to have time to discuss, just to get into all that right now. But we will see some of what John Quincy Adams does on the slavery issue and other issues, domestic policy issues, in the coming weeks.